Hello, everybody. Welcome to the webinar, Alternative Visions of Space Exploration, produced by the Cultural Considerations Working Group of the Moon Village Association. I am Remo Rapetti, co-chair of the working group. After the MVA was founded, the first principles issued in 2018 stated, the Moon Village is a global community aiming to explore, use, and develop the resources of the Moon in a sustainable, open, and peaceful manner for the benefit of all humanity and with the opportunities for all people to contribute to its success. This vision includes spacefaring and non-spacefaring nations and the public, and offers an opportunity for all countries and organizations to play a role in this endeavor. The implementation of the Moon Village will be a major step forward for humanity, including the enhancement of knowledge, progress, and world peace. Since then, the MVA has worked in this direction and has attained a considerable reputation. But still, the situation of space exploration is far from being beneficial to all people and offering the same opportunities both to spacefaring and non-spacefaring countries. On the contrary, the increasing pressure from private companies risks betraying the fundamental principles of sustainability, openness, and even peacefulness of future space missions in favor of the profit of a few. To discuss this important issue, we have invited two speakers who are the co-editors of a book titled Reclaiming Space, Progressive and Multicultural Visions of Space Exploration, containing several essays by experts coming from different academic backgrounds and different countries, suggesting alternative approaches to space exploration. The first speaker is Jamie Johnson-Schwartz, who is an associate professor of philosophy at Wichita State University, author of The Value of Science in Space Exploration, and lead editor of the above-mentioned Reclaiming Space, and also of The Ethics of Space Exploration. The second speaker is Erika Nesvold. She is an astrophysicist who has worked as a researcher at NASA Goddard and the Carnegie Institution for Science. Now she is a developer for Universe Sandbox, a physics-based space simulator, co-founder of the nonprofit organization, the Just Space Alliance, and the creator and host of the podcast, Making New Worlds. She is also the author of Off Earth, Ethical Questions and Quandaries for Living in Outer Space. After the presentations, as usual, the attendees who have registered can ask questions via the chat button. But now let's go to the first presentation. Jamie Schwartz will talk about reflections on reclaiming space. Jamie, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you so much, Remo. And I'd like to say thanks for having me on for a second time. I believe it was 2 or 3 years ago you had me on. I don't know if it was to promote the value of space or something else, but thanks for having me back and for having Erika alongside. Let me go ahead and start sharing my slides. Screens, there we are. So I've, I suppose, titled this introduction / book promotion / just discussion of the book listening to others. And that's because I think that really captures the spirit of what we were trying to do with the volume. And I'll explain that in a couple more moments. Minor correction, but no apologies needed. It would be difficult to have known. I'm currently unaffiliated, so I'm no longer with Wichita State University. I just wanted to make that clear so that I'm not perceived to be speaking on behalf of Wichita State at this time. And let's make sure I'm actually in the window so I can advance my slides. There we go. So since we're listening to others, I can't help but remember the lovely Tumblr discourse on the otter, and the sort of consonance between other and otter is the joke here. And just a fun thought to begin the talk with. Any institution built by human beings can be reformed, attacked, or undermined by otter human beings. We see this text displayed in front of a very stately looking otter. This is not entirely inapplicable to reclaiming space, because whatever we do is something that we humans have done, and we humans could have done differently. So what I'd like to share just about the book and how we made it, why we made it, is that there was this critical mass that was being reached in response to the new space movement of folks recognizing that we hadn't heard from very many different kinds of people about what is worth doing in space, who should be up there engaging in spaceflight activities, and what kinds of benefits might accrue from those things. And so instead of just assuming that the dominant narrative was true and needed to be taught to everyone else, we instead decided to just go and ask everyone we could think of, what do you care about in space? What is it you find passionate in space? What do you think we should be doing or not doing in space? Not just because it's your view, but because it's a view based on your life and the unique things that have happened in your life. So something I advise readers to keep in mind is that we never asked any of our contributors to argue against anything. If they did so, it was because they felt that's what they wanted or needed to say. So we did not ask our contributors to argue or persuade, but we did ask them to express themselves. And we gave them free license to express themselves however they saw fit within the confines of what our publisher would permit, Oxford University Press, and they were lovely in the amount of creative leeway that they provided us. It was sort of a joke early on in the production of the volume, but you can kind of think of it as chicken soup for the space explorer's soul, if you're at all familiar with the Chicken Soup series of books, which maybe, hopefully, has been confined to the States, but perhaps has found its way across the pond. So we had a guiding value, and that was that we needed to listen more than to speak. And for the most part, we needed to listen to people we hadn't previously heard before. And so we deliberately set out to find the impossible, right? To find what we hadn't found before. That is, we were trying to seek out contributors who are not already necessarily well known in spaceflight culture, or who have a position that is very different from those who have dominant perspectives in spaceflight culture. And there's no way to do that in one book. There's no way to do justice to the variety of perspective that's out there. So Reclaiming Space is a very imperfect and very incomplete work, is among an early instance of a kind of conversation we need to be having more and more of. And in particular, I'd like to acknowledge our failures to have good Indigenous representation, as well as good East, West, any kind of Asian representation as well. We got pretty much everywhere around the world except for those places. And of course, there's plenty of variation within culture. So just because we had somebody from one country doesn't mean we had that country's perspective. Rather, we need that country's perspectives. So this is not anywhere close to the final word on what an inclusive conversation about space exploration might look like. It's rather a first attempt to try to have that conversation in a very tolerating and listening environment. So what I want to do in my talk is share some of the things I've learned from the contributors to this book. And things I've learned not by going into their chapters with an expectation about what they were going to tell me, not even going into their chapters with an expectation about what I should or shouldn't believe before and after, but just by hearing what they have to say and what they think is worth talking about. Now, I'm not going to discuss every chapter, and I hope none of my contributors feel offended if I leave them out. because what I want to do here is emphasize the lessons, the chapters that were most personally significant to me, and those may or may not be the same chapters that are most personally significant to you. You are a different person than me, whoever you are listening, so you're not going to have exactly the same relationship to the volume as I do. But I will, for the sake of the prospective reader, go through this in the order in which the chapters appear, so at least you could follow along sequentially if you happen to have a copy of the book with you or decide to pick one up later. So I want to first talk about what I learned from Ed C. Davis IV. This is chapter 4 of the volume. I think I mentioned the chapter in virtually every other slide. I must have forgot it here. But who is Dr. Edward C. Davis IV? Well, he's a historic linguistic anthropologist who earned his bachelor's at the Gallatin School of New York. He also has degrees, a master's degree and a doctoral degree in African American Studies, which he earned under Laura Nader at UC Berkeley. So someone who is rather credentialed in thinking about human societies and human cultures. And what did I learn from his chapter? Well, I learned that not everything about space has to be oriented to or created for a weird audience. That is, a white, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic, or other words, white male Western, as some might say. And when I learned to decenter questions about space exploration from sort of my home orientation, I learned that there are all kinds of other space visionaries and space artists that have beautiful things to share with us, including especially, and Dr. Davis is not the only one that mentions Sun Ra, but the just pivotal and famous jazz composer and filmmaker Sun Ra, especially the 1974 film, which was also a, I believe, theater production or a musical production that traveled around the country in the States. Space is the Place. So I'd like to share you probably my favorite 2 minutes of that movie. And I think that's going to require me to change what I am sharing so you can hear. So just bear with me one moment. So all I would say as a preface to this is that this is not prepared for a white Western audience. This is prepared for and by Black Americans as part of the Back to Africa movement in the 70s. That is the context in which you should interpret this clip.
Boring, just the same old, same thing. Come on, time up without a space, waves incorporated. If you find Earth boring, just the same old, same thing. Come on, sign up without a space, waves incorporated. If you find Earth boring, just the same old, same thing. Come on.
Good morning, Mr. Ra. Let me introduce myself. My name's Curtis Rockwell. I work for NASA, designing guidance systems. I designed the M402 system for them. For NASA, that is. Let me be blunt, Mr. Ra. I've got a wife and 7 kids, and if I don't get a job pretty soon, I'm afraid we're going to all be out in the street, or what's worse, on welfare.
You can get a job on our discipline planes, but being of the particular race you are.
Oh, no. I'd consider a cut in salary.
We don't really have salaries in our dimension. We creators never receive anything for our work.
I could learn your methods?
Multiplicity adjustment, readjustment, synthesis, isotope teleportation, transmolecularization, frequency polarization, intergalactic realm of eternal darkness, intergalactic realm of eternal black darkness, white darkness, infinity incorporated.
Oh, I see, Mr. Ra. Well, thank you very much. It's been nice. I've got to be going now. I really have another appointment.
You find Earth boring, just the same old, same thing. Come on, sign up without a space wave, incorporated. You find Earth boring, just the same old, same thing. Come on, sign up without.
So, I mean, listen or try to hear that song that was being sung. If you find Earth boring and the same old thing, why don't we come to the space age? I take that as a powerful message told in the 70s that why aren't we trying something different in space? Why do we keep doing the same thing, expecting a different result? To translate into words that I would share, I think that's what I would say here, that there are plenty of different ways to approach space exploration and developing human societies in space, if only we would reach out to people who have already been crafting those visions for decades, if not centuries. So on to another author, Vandana Singh, author of Chapter 8. And Professor Singh is an Indian science fiction writer who also has a position at Framingham State University. Her research job is a particle physicist, but she's also a science fiction author, and she's got some very insightful short stories, my favorite being Sailing the Antarctica. And that also appears in her volume Ambiguity Machines and Other Stories, which was shortlisted for the Philip K. Dick Award. Now, what Vandana's chapter addresses is the kind of motivation or heart with which we go out into the universe. And something I learned from her is about the great variety of different reasons we have for going into space. We're not all here for the same reason. We're not all here in support of the same activities or objectives. We're individuals. We have unique and special relationships, not only with our home planet, but with the cosmos. And so, to quote from her chapter, provided my Zoom preview doesn't cut off text I need to read. There we go. Okay. So what speculative fiction can do, Singh says, can make us aware of our default unquestioned assumptions about the world by immersing us in entirely different ways of being, thinking, and exploring. We can stretch the boundaries of the imagination past the mechanistic, Eurocentric, colonialist ways of thinking about Earth and space. We can listen to the histories and stories that have been pushed aside by colonialism, and to think about reasons to explore both Earth and space that are just, inclusive, and motivated by the best that we are capable of as a species. Now, best doesn't necessarily mean right stuff. We need to re-examine what it means to be the best we can be as humans, is also what Singh is imploring here. And we can use fiction, we can read stories to help learn these things, as long as we're willing to read stories widely and not just one kind of story over and over again. Another chapter I learned a lot from was the chapter authored by Danielle Wood and her colleagues at the MIT Media Lab, chapter 9 of the volume. This chapter was co-authored by 4 or 5 different people, so apologies to her co-authors, but I'll only tell you about who Danielle is. You can read the volume to find out more about her very interesting and important contributors. But so Professor Woods, assistant professor at Media, Art, and Sciences at MIT, and she also holds a joint appointment at the Department of Aeronautics and Astronautics. And as you can see, she is incredibly well credentialed to speak not only about space mechanics, but also about space societies. And what I learned from reading that chapter many, many times was how to appreciate the poetry and work of Audre Lorde, and in particular, the essay of Lorde's, The Uses of the Erotic. And here is a place where Wood et al. Are describing what we can learn from works such as that. So, to quote Wood, Lorde explains that, quote, the principal horror of any system which defines the good in terms of profit rather than in terms of human need is that it robs our work of its erotic value. Now, don't think of erotic as merely pornographic. It does include that, but it really refers to, I think, any kind of intimacy or depth of feeling you can have with or for a thing. So think about it as robbing its emotional value. That's a misdescription of Lorde to some degree, but I'm not a scholar in that area. I have to be careful here. So the principal issue is that it robs our work of its erotic value, its erotic power and life appeal and fulfillment. So Wood is telling us we need to learn how to be fulfilled by space in different ways, that this creative energy of the erotic can motivate us to see that it will be fulfilling to do the work to design liberatory ways for humans to live in space. It will be fulfilling to ask how residents of a space station traveling together for years can share their cultural differences peacefully. It will be fulfilling to develop a sense of stewardship and concern for the new locations in space when humans will sojourn before the next generation takes their turn. And each of these fulfilling endeavors can also serve as templates for the changes that are needed to work towards a flourishing society on Earth. We shouldn't be so obsessed with the end state. We should be obsessed with doing well by the people that are involved at every step along the way. I learned a lot by learning and viewing Jackie Nyeri's art for the first time. Jackie Nyeri's a Kenyan space artist who has had displays of her work all over the world. And what I'm about to show you, I believe, are two images from her Maasai series. And so these appear on plates 1 and 2 of the volume. We did get some color artwork in there. And in particular, what I've shown here are her works She Story and Three Wise Men. And the way I've summarized my lesson here is I've learned just how colorful space exploration can be. I never saw imagery of spaceflight that was so vibrant before I saw Jackie's art, because all we tend to see are these very gray, very white images that only have a black background as a contrast. And otherwise, there's virtually no color anywhere but a national flag. And here we see people dressed in the colors that they would ordinarily wear in their daily lives, going through and exploring the universe. I find that fascinating and enlightening in ways that I am still unpacking myself. I learned a lot from Ingrid Lafleur's chapter, who's a curator, pleasure activist, and artist, as well as an Afro-future theorist. That is someone who thinks about the future from a characteristically African-American or Black American perspective, as opposed to an African futurist who would think about the future from a characteristically African perspective. And those two groups have a lot in common, but because they have different life stories, they have ultimately different cultural experiences and different cultural insights to offer. But at any rate, so Jackie Nyeri would be an example of an African futurist. Ingrid Lafleur now is an example of an Afro-futurist. And she happens to run an institute, the Afrofuture Strategies Institute, and she's trying to share this kind of vision, this approach for thinking about the future through that. And to quote from her chapter, be it a utopia or dystopia, Afrofuture images of space guide us to another consciousness. Because the inner reflects the outer and vice versa, a self-assessment is required before embarking on any imagination exercise. We need to think before we leap. We need to listen before we leap. We must be made aware continuously of our colonized mind, since all is shaped from it. What is influencing our decisions in the now, and how can we imagine differently? What is influencing how we relate to humans, the Earth, and to the cosmos and all of their inhabitants? It's more of a point to be honest and less about addressing good versus bad. Peace and balance is the goal, and to find the rhythm of the universe and to be in tune with it, rather than to see it as an object to be explored or exploited or conquested and so forth. Perhaps my favorite chapter of the volume, not because I consider it to be the most important or the most insightful, but because I find it to be the most personally significant and addressing hopes and fears that I experience in between Diet Cokes every day. Comes from Professor Catherine Denny, who's a Canadian anthropologist that is well known to the SETI community and who has been engaged in work like the work that Eric and I have done for a decade longer than I have. And I've been doing this for close to 15 years at this point. So what Catherine wrote about was, or sorry, what Professor Denny wrote about was what we have a right to hope for. And I found this message to be very encouraging, that the hope for space is not that it will provide us with an off-Earth backup for humanity. I mean, maybe it will, maybe it won't, but there's no guarantee, okay? So it's not that it's going to provide us with this backup or resources without end or journeys to the stars. Again, it might do those things, it might not. We can't assume that they will. Instead, I hope that we can find our way to multilateral solutions for shared problems, to fairness, and to effective compromises regarding the commons of space. In a world where megacorporations and the hyper-wealthy often wield inordinate influence in shaping rules, or effectively outmaneuver regulation, or just break the rules and pay the fines. We've seen some crashing of microbes on the moon. We've seen a Tesla violate the planetary protection protocols. Nobody's holding these people to account, it seems. It is easy to wonder whether laws and guidelines really matter, but they do. They matter. And those laws and guidelines are continually being remade, which constitutes an opportunity for input, and international and multi-stakeholder alliances are essential. And reclaiming space is about trying to bring together an alliance that is genuinely international and multi-stakeholder. I learned quite a lot from Alice Gorman's chapter, professor of archaeology and author of the well-regarded book, Dr. Space Junk vs. the Universe, Archaeology and the Future. Dr. Gorman's chapter, Professor Gorman's chapter, focuses on what space habitats might be like if they were designed by women instead of men. And that taught me to think a lot more creatively about the design of space vehicles and space habitats. Thus, to quote Gorman, was the cost of developing female-adapted spacesuits higher than the cost of not developing them? She's asking this question in the context of some embarrassing news for NASA a few years ago about there being no spacesuit of the right size for a certain female crew member, as well as the overall neglect to consider the possibility of female astronauts despite women training the exact same training during the Mercury program. If you've ever heard of the, I think, Mercury 13, or is it the Mercury 17? At any rate, there's a group of women who went through the same training, but NASA really didn't find any interest in that. It wasn't very politically feasible at the time, even though it was ethically obligatory the whole time. So, okay. So what was the cost of developing female-adapted spacesuits higher than the cost of not developing them? Well, Joe Cosmo, a NASA engineer who worked on spacesuit designs from the Mercury program through the space shuttle, believed that if women had succeeded in gaining access to the astronaut program in the 1960s, which they went through the training and passed it, an in-suit waste management system would have been introduced at that stage rather than waiting for the space shuttle generation of suits. Reframing the narrative in this way highlights faulty design principles, which are incapable of adapting to different bodies, and the failure to take into account the true cost of living into space to begin with. The problem, one might say, was never the presence of women, it was rather their absence. I've learned a lot from Sherry Wells Jensen, and not just this chapter, so I might be speaking about her contributions to space exploration far more generally than is represented merely in this chapter. But Professor Wells Jensen's an associate professor of English at Bowling Green State University, where she specializes in xenolinguistics as well as astrobiology. And among her many credentials are a recent service as Baruch Blumberg Library of Congress Chair of Astrobiology, which is the highest honor someone doing this kind of work presently can be bestowed upon. I don't know of any higher honor for someone working in space ethics and issues related to that. If there is one, please let me know. I'd like to apply. So what have I learned from Sherry? Well, I've learned that we need to include disabled people from the very beginning. They are not an afterthought. They are an integral part of society, both here on Earth and in space. To quote Sherry, given that 1 in 5 people on Earth, arguably including some of our best scientists and most creative artists, is disabled, it's reasonable to ask what motivated and still motivates these wholesale exclusions from including disabled people in space exploration planning. After all, we want the very best people in space, so why are we eliminating so many without even looking at their resumes? It seems self-defeating, and I would argue it is self-defeating. What is motivating this nonsense? Why haven't disabled people taken their place in orbit with everyone else? Now, there have been some disabled people that have gotten into orbit, or at least suborbital flights, so this is not a thing that hasn't happened at all, but why has it taken this long for even the first steps? I also learned some things from my co-editor, Erica Nesfold. I want to be fair and give her the same introduction I've given the rest of our contributors, but I think she's already been given one that says many of these things, so I will not repeat them unless I see something here I think I really want to mention. I don't remember if it was mentioned that she co-founded the Just Space Alliance with Lucian Volkovits in 2018, but I would consider that to be a very significant organization that is doing very good work. And I'm grateful that Erica has helped lead the way in that regard. So what I learned from Erica's chapter, or rather Dr. Nessvold's chapter, is, there are many different ways that we are going to need to protect human rights in space, including the rights of workers and laborers. So to quote Nessvold, the physical hazards of space will exceed those experienced by railroad builders and operators. But the greater challenge, the greater danger for space workers may come from labor inequalities and power imbalances that parallel those faced by railroad workers in the 19th century. The railroad companies took advantage of the existing marginalization of their primarily Chinese workforce to decrease wages, then used the workers' physical isolation and dependence on fragile supply lines against them when they protested. Think about living and working at one of Jeff Bezos's factories in space. What are those working conditions going to be like? I hope no one ever has to find out. When humanity is regularly living and working in space, such power imbalances combined with the harsh and dangerous environment will make workers vulnerable to similar labor abuses. I learned something from Ruvimbo Simanga's chapter, who is a lawyer who is involved with the Space in Africa group. Her home country is Kenya, and you can see she's been involved with very many different kinds of UN-level discussions about space equity and law and policy. And among the things I've learned from Ruvimbo, it includes a reminder that we don't get into space unless we exploit minerals from Africa. Virtually every space vehicle constructed has in some way used minerals that were originally mined from African ore. So we don't get into space without the continued exploitation of one of the most exploited continents on the planet. And I don't want that to be the future. I would like to see that burden distributed much more fairly around the world if we're going to claim that space benefits us fairly around the world. Otherwise, we are just fooling ourselves with bullshit slogans. So to quote from Simanga, how can we think more constructively about this? Well, look to Africa. It is a continent that has societies that have survived for thousands of years. If we don't think we can learn something about conflict resolution from that, we're insane. So we must also consider the role those different regions will assume in international cooperative efforts towards lunar industry and development. She's only focused on lunar mining, not the whole universe here. Africa, with all its expertise in managing multi-stakeholder interests in the terrestrial mining industry, has a large role to play in fostering research towards an international framework on space mining based on Africa's rich extractive industry experience. There are a couple of euphemisms there. Its rich extractive industry experience includes foreign companies coming in and devastating communities and landscapes. I'll be a little more brief going forward because I know I'm about out of time for my portion of the talk. But I learned quite a bit from Evie Kendall, who is far too credentialed for me to even quickly summarize. But perhaps most saliently, she works as a bioethics researcher and public health researcher at Swinburne University of Technology, focusing on reproductive ethics and reproductive health. And I think what Dr. Kendall teaches us is that we need to be very considerate of the most vulnerable individuals in space exploration, especially those individuals who may be responsible for rearing children, especially using their bodies to rear children. As Kendall says, developing an ethical method for selecting humans for Noah's Ark requires that we first try to avoid the disasters that might necessitate such a project. Why would we throw people into a situation we know is a problem? It sounds like abuse rather than a solution. So first, we should try to avoid creating situations that might necessitate this kind of selection project for who's going to be the best to recreate people in space. Then, and only then, only after we do that, do we try to develop a fair selection criteria that promotes diversity, reproductive autonomy, and survival potential, not only survival potential, not survival potential as a final overriding value, but just one value among many, including diversity and reproductive autonomy. Thus, Kendall says we need to ensure that not just human life, but human values survive. And this requires that we avoid unfair discrimination in our selection of candidates for astronauts, for space missions, for Arkship missions, and carefully consider how we might prioritize historically disadvantaged groups for inclusion to promote diversity and restorative justice. I learned a bit from Janet Devine, who's an academic and sort of education scientist who also has experience as an actor, including 2 roles in Slumdog Millionaire. And she is, I think, the only person I have heard of in the world so far to think about what an education system for children growing up in space might look like. I would love to be wrong about that, but so far as I'm aware, Janet's the only one. And so what I learned from Janet Devine is that we know basically nothing about how to educate children in space. And thus, we need to consider questions that she asks, such as, what models of education might we develop to take into the future, to take into space? Any discussion of decolonizing the curriculum must be pluridimensional in nature. Interesting, pluridimensional rather than multidimensional. Multi just means, more than one. Plura means many, right? So we need to have a many-dimensional approach to curriculum, not just a sort of 2- or 3-dimensional approach. It must look to the wrongs of the past, the ideologies, the inequalities, and prejudices of the present, and a systemic recentering of future practice. Think about the future for education, not about right now if we're going to be educating people in the future. Our own stories tell us that Western models are unsustainable. Let's re-examine who we are as one human race through these lenses, acknowledging who and what we've been, looking to where we're going, and working towards what we could be. Finally, I learned something from our final contributor to the volume, Francesca Ferrando, who is a doctor that teaches philosophy at NYU and is among the premier researchers of post-humanity and application to space exploration. And what I learned from Ferrando is that their decision to end their chapter with a poem reminded me that I used to think about space through poetry. And so I would like to nearly conclude this talk. I have one more slide after this, but I would like to bring this talk close to a conclusion by merely reading my favorite line from Ferrando's poem. It does not matter who you are, because you are me and I am you. And we have always been together, just a million years apart, us today versus distant human descendants in the stars. Nothing, just a blink of an eye. You may not get this metaphor now that telepathy has replaced vision, but think it this way. Do you ever dream of biological beings? If so, I am one of them. So my advice to anyone considering reading the book is don't read it back to front. That's a really boring task I've had to do far too many times myself. What you should do is start by looking at the contributor bios, read about the people in the book, think about who's leading the most interesting kind of life, and go read their chapter. Because if you don't enjoy a chapter written by someone you think is interesting, you're probably going to dislike the remaining chapters far, far more. So don't read the chapters you don't like, read the chapters you like, but then read the chapters you don't like, because you're going to learn something from them, regardless of how you feel throughout the reading process or afterwards. I can't tell you whether to buy the book or not. I can't even tell you where to start to read it. Any page is a good page as far as I'm concerned. I'm just happy that people are reading and listening to the book. And thank you, Remo, so much for this opportunity to introduce it to you.
Thank you, Jamie. Thank you. It was a very interesting speech that gave us a lot to think about. And now, Erika Neswold will talk about culture on the moon, the practical and ethical value of including diverse cultural perspectives in space exploration. Please, Erika, go ahead.
Thank you very much, and thank you to Jamie for that wonderful first talk about our book, which we co-edited with Linda Billings. So since Jamie, I knew, was going to be talking about reclaiming space, I wanted to use my time to sort of use that as a launch pad um, to make an argument based on a lot of what Jamie said about what the not just ethical value, but the practical value of doing all of this listening is. So just real quickly, first, let me give you my background. It's slightly different than Jamie's because I am from the STEM side. I am an astrophysicist. I've worked as a research astrophysicist, but then when I was a postdoc several years ago, I started to get interested in the ethical and human rights challenges of space settlement. And so I took that curiosity and I channeled it through making a podcast called Making New Worlds, which I later turned into a book that came out last year called Off Earth: Ethical Questions and Quandaries for Living in Outer Space, which is sort of a public level exploration of a lot of these issues, including labor rights, which is what I wrote about in Reclaiming Space, but also things like reproductive justice in space or environmental justice in space, lots of different topics like that. And as part of all of this work and this networking and interviewing I was doing, I met Jamie and Linda, and they graciously invited me to help co-edit Reclaiming Space, which is also a wonderful experience. And I also encountered and met Lucian Wakowicz, another astronomer at the time of the Adler Planetarium, who was thinking about a lot of these same issues. And in 2018, we decided to co-found a nonprofit called the Just Space Alliance, which advocates for a more ethical future in space and also tries to harness people's excitement for space to get them to be more aware of human rights and ethics issues here on Earth today. So that's just a quick overview of my background. I've had a look through some of the past, more recent past webinars from the Moon Village hosted, which all look very interesting. But my sense is that most of the recent webinars have been about the influence of the moon in human culture, how the moon has been considered in various belief systems, or how living in space will affect our human psychology and our culture going forward. All very fascinating topics. But today I'm going to ask you to think about the converse, which is how different human cultures, like many of the different perspectives presented in Reclaiming Space, will shape how we explore and live on the moon. And I'm going to make the argument that welcoming this diverse range of cultures, doing all this listening, is going to provide us with a practical advantage in these plans, as well as obviously being a good choice ethically to be as inclusive as possible. As Jamie mentioned, the conversation about space exploration and in particular space settlement is currently being dominated by a couple of main big cultural monoliths. In the US, of course, and in Silicon Valley, where a lot of private space flight is being developed, this is dominated by Western culture. And that in turn has historically been heavily influenced by the ideals of colonialism. And so partly this is because the history of human space exploration is also the history of national competition. So these nationalistic values and cultures are embedded in the rhetoric about space in most of the spacefaring nations. So this is, of course, the primary culture that dominates the conversation in the US, China, and Russia, and all these other and in Europe, that all these major spacefaring nations tend to embed a lot of that kind of national values in the rhetoric around space. Now, much has been written about the pros and cons of this particular culture, its values, its approach to space exploration, certainly in Reclaiming Space. You can find whole papers written just on this painting that I'm showing, which is called American Progress by John Gast. There's a lot about the colonialist model of looking at space and the ideas of manifest destiny and the possible implications of that. But today, I just want you to consider, or at least for the next 20 minutes, I just want you to consider the implications of having any one single culture dominate an endeavor that's as massive and as complex as thinking about humanity's future in space. And another reason that sort of having a monoculture in space conversations is a problem is that it conflicts with a lot of our stated ideals about space. This is Article 1 of the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, and it mentions over and over again the idea of space being the province of all mankind, of our endeavors in space. They should be in the interest of all countries without discrimination. Equality is important. When Remo was introducing the background of the Moon Village Association, I heard a lot of these same ideas. And so in order to adhere to these ideals, we need to make sure we're inviting as many diverse voices into the conversation as possible, and invite these diverse cultures in the people who research, who study, plan, imagine, and actually perform space exploration. And of course, historically, this hasn't been great. This is a picture of the Apollo 11 control room, obviously very dominated by a single demographic, and this has been getting better over time. On the left here are a couple of more recent control rooms from ISRO on the top in India, and that's, I think, JPL down at the bottom, celebrating a successful landing. And so this has been getting better, but there is more work to do. Here again, I'm showing what Jamie shared, my favorite piece from Jackie Nieri's Masai series, and the idea of getting more of this diversity and colorfulness into our conversations and perspectives. But what I'm going to argue today is that this isn't just a one-way street. It's not just the dominant culture being nice. There's countless ways in which including these diverse cultural backgrounds in our plans for the future are going to benefit the effectiveness of those plans. So I want to present you with three examples today. Real quick before I start, I'll note that I myself am a member of this dominant culture, and so I'm going to be speaking today about cultures that are not my own. I highly recommend following up on this talk by reading and listening to the works of members of the cultures I'm going to talk about to really get their perspective directly in their own words, maybe follow up and invite some of them to give future webinars for you. So the first example I want to give, this was introduced to me by a woman named Alice Connick Glenn, who gave a talk at Starship Congress in 2017, which you can still find on YouTube. This is a screenshot from it. I had a subsequent conversation with her on my podcast, Making New Worlds, which is also still available online. Alice Glenn is an Inupiaq woman. So the Inupiaq are an indigenous people who live in very northern Alaska. So Glenn was born and raised in the northernmost town in the United States, which is inside the Arctic Circle, which means it gets dark for months at a time. And then in the summer, the sun doesn't set for months at a time. And when Glenn went to university and started studying aerospace science, she started noticing similarities between all of these potential challenges of living in space that she was reading about and the physical characteristics of her home in the Arctic. So she put together and gave this talk to argue that people who are planning for long-term space flight and space settlement can and should look to communities like the Inupiaq for lessons into not just how to survive in a harsh environment like this, but how to build thriving, happy communities in an isolated, harsh environment. And so she had a lot of comparisons between her home in the Arctic and space. For one thing, you tend to see this, especially away from the villages, this cold, dark, in the winter months, desolate landscape. This is a photo near Dead Horse, Alaska, which is also on the northern coast of Alaska. And you can see it. It doesn't look unlike the magnificent desolation of the lunar landscape as described by Buzz Aldrin during the Apollo 11 mission. The Arctic is also very remote. You don't exactly need a rocket ship to get there, but many villages are only accessible by airplane for part of the year and only when the weather is good. So it can be very difficult to get in and out. There's also poor communication. There tends to be poor cellular network coverage, poor internet infrastructure, and so it's hard to communicate with the outside world. Perhaps there's a delay like there would be in space. Alice Glenn also says people naturally tend to stay indoors during the cold weather months of the year, and she says that's similar to living in a spaceship for an extended period of time. You can get a lot of claustrophobia and cabin fever. And yet, despite this, Alice Glenn likes living in the Arctic, and she says that they have really, really happy communities. And so how do the Inupiaq people do that? So here are a few of the tips she pointed out, some characteristics of her culture that she's identified that she thinks would be useful in living in space. One is very practically just adaptability and preparedness. So this is a lovely photo of an Inupiaq family from 1929, and you see they have this very well-designed clothing for living in the Arctic. It's made with what space people would call in situ resources, so they have adapted very well to their environment. But the Inupiaq people, like a lot of indigenous people, have had to adapt not just to their environments, but to changing conditions over time, especially in the past couple of centuries due to colonization, exploitation, climate change. And she argues that just this approach to continuing to adapt to changing conditions, being prepared for anything that might happen, is very crucial for survival. Glenn also points out that her people have a very useful attitude, which is one of no complaints, we're all in this together, and we all have to get along together, and a heavy emphasis on cooperation. So this is a still from a 2017 documentary on Inupiaq whale hunts. Whaling is a huge part of Inupiaq culture because they have depended so heavily on whale hunting, and it's not something that any one person can do alone. Like space exploration, it has to be a communal endeavor, and so there's a big emphasis on communal cooperation in her culture. But aside from basic survival, food and clothing, they're a community. They raise children. They try to have happy lives. And Glenn emphasized the importance of gathering community and in particular celebrations in her culture in order to fight off the feelings of isolation and the desolation of that beautiful landscape. And so she talked about a few different kinds of celebrations in her culture. This is a photo from Kivgik, which is a messenger feast. You send messengers to all the local communities and village. You gather, you dance. The children learn how to dance during the celebration. Another big celebration that she enjoys is Nalakatak, which is their springtime whaling festival. In particular, they have a very famous event called the blanket toss. You can't see the blanket in this photo because there's too many people in the way, but they put someone on a large blanket or whale skin and toss them up into the air, which was originally used to sight whales at a distance and now is incorporated as part of their celebration and their culture. And so you can also imagine in space developing these local celebrations that emphasize gathering of people together and adapting local practices as part of your rituals and cultures. And so I find, I was very excited to talk to Alice Glenn because I find this idea fascinating and really vital to thinking about, again, not just surviving, but building thriving communities in space. And it makes me wonder, what else could we learn about how to live well in space by talking to diverse cultures around this planet? What could we learn from nomadic peoples like the herders of Mongolian steppes, or people whose cultures come from a history of extreme exploration, like the Polynesians who expanded across the Pacific Islands, or cultures that developed in small, isolated societies, like a space settlement would be. So people from islands or mountain dwellers in very remote mountains, or just other groups I haven't thought of yet due to my own limited cultural background and my lack of exposure to these various cultures. And so I like to start off thinking about these ways because it makes you think about the not just the technology and how do we grow plants in space, but the other things we're going to have to figure out along the way as more people are living in space. How do we build community? How do we build culture? And what can we learn from the many, many, many different cultures and societies here on Earth who have been doing that for generations? Another example of practical wisdom that we can learn from cultures that aren't currently being heard from is environmental sustainability. So many indigenous cultures have really excelled at living sustainably within their environments for centuries, often more so than Western culture, in particular colonizing cultures. Colonization, that mindset tends to lead to a lot of just gobbling up resources without thinking about the possible consequences. And this is something that we're all living in the shadow of today as we look at dealing with resource overuse, pollution, climate change, etc. And sustainability is becoming more and more of a concern in space policy and space research, most urgently in low Earth orbit, where we're developing a problem with space debris. But that'll also continue to be a topic as we set our sights farther away, say lunar mining, which I know is a big topic for people focused on the moon. And yet we know that mining has had a devastating impact on environments here on Earth. But certain groups and industries are really highly motivated to go out to the moon and elsewhere in space to extract and exploit these resources, to use them to build infrastructure, to use them to achieve our dreams in space, and also just to use them to make a profit. So we have to face these questions of how do we balance all of these competing interests and the interests of future generations. And this is a case where we can learn from these cultures, these indigenous cultures who have had to answer these same kinds of questions and have done it in a variety of ways, some perhaps more successful than the dominant culture that's leading the way in space right now. So one of the examples that I find really fascinating along this topic is the idea of legal personhood of environmental features. So what I'm showing you here is a photo of the Wanganui River, which is in New Zealand. And this, like many rivers, this river in particular is considered to be by the indigenous Maori people there considered to be essentially a family member, so something with an identity and agency in its own right that deserves respect as a relative, as a family member. And so New Zealand has been doing, honestly, a pretty good job, especially compared to other Western countries, of beginning to incorporate these indigenous perspectives and worldviews into their legal system. And in 2017, New Zealand passed a law granting legal personhood to the Wanganui River, which means that anytime there's legislation or in particular a court case that would affect the river, say deciding something about waste disposal or water usage or fishing rights, a human representative is appointed to speak on behalf of the river and defend the rights of the river itself, which on the one hand is very important for incorporating and acknowledging the fact that the Maori people have been here longer than the New Zealand government have, and they have their own worldviews and perspectives on the environment, and that's important. And it also means that there's this extra mechanism for environmental protection built into the legal system to ensure the protection of the river for its own sake, and also for everyone else who wants to benefit from the river in the future and benefit from the river's protection. And so some people have looked at this and other cases of legal personhood for the environment and suggested maybe we should consider this for parts of the space environment. I'm showing you a little screenshot here from the Declaration on the Rights of the Moon, which was published in 2021 by the Australian Earth Laws Alliance, the Center for Democratic and Environmental Rights, and a few other space researchers, including Alice Gorman, who Jamie mentioned as a contributor in Reclaiming Space. And this isn't any kind of legal proposal, but it is I think more of a conversation starter and an argument that perhaps we should acknowledge the intrinsic rights of the moon itself. And that makes me think about someday, should we consider granting legal personhood to the moon, some aspects of the moon, or to other parts of space, in order to follow along these same kinds of ideas. There are certainly plenty of humans and human cultures who acknowledge the moon as having, as in their belief system, as having an identity and a personhood. But I find this interesting because I come from a belief system that does not consider non-living parts of the environment to have their own identity, to be persons. And yet, I think that this is a really useful model for environmental protection, whether it's a part of your belief system or not, because it forces us to appoint a representative, an advocate, to argue for parts of the environment that otherwise wouldn't be spoken for, as the rest of us are squabbling about what to do with a given environment. So I think this is a really valuable perspective and mechanism, both ethically for inclusion reasons and just practically to save us from ourselves and some of our own worst instincts towards sustainability. And the last example I want to talk about is a culture not from an ethnic community, but one that's brought together by circumstance, which is the disabled community. I've had the privilege of talking to a number of disability rights activists and advocates about space travel and physical accessibility. And this is something that Jamie recapped a little bit, in particular from Sherry Wells Jensen's chapter in Reclaiming Space. So as you're probably aware, physical health screenings for astronauts, especially government-employed agency astronauts, are extremely strict. To get hired as an astronaut, you have to be within a certain height range, you have to have correctable vision up to a certain level, you have to have 4 functional limbs, and that's just in order to apply to be an astronaut. Once you get accepted into the process of possibly being selected, then you have to go through much more rigorous physical health screenings. And so, which is why for the entire history of human spaceflight, in particular government-funded spaceflight, all of the astronauts that we see have been extremely physically abled. So from the time when they were mostly military test pilots, like back in the Apollo 11 era, seen here, all the way up through the most recent NASA selection class. I think this was in 2021, this selection group. They've gotten more diverse, but not in terms of disability. They're still very able-bodied because of the restrictions. Now, there are both practical and ethical reasons for these kinds of restrictions. For one thing, NASA wants to screen out any potential health problems that could result in a predictable and avoidable medical emergency in space that could harm or even kill an astronaut. And they have a mission to accomplish. They want to make sure that the astronauts can accomplish the tasks that are given to them with the equipment provided. That the height restrictions are about being able to fit into a spacesuit or a capsule. They need to be able to operate the equipment, and so that's where the limitations on limbs comes from. However, if you talk to disability rights advocates, as I have, and listen to them as Jamie recommends, they point out some interesting things. One is that as humans spend more and more time in space, farther and farther from the Earth, so with limited evacuation back to the Earth, and someday far in the future when humans are born in space, we are going to eventually end up with disabled humans in space no matter what. So we do need to think about that eventuality, no matter how far away it is. Plus, as many disability rights activists have pointed out to me, but in particular, I'll quote Jessie Shanahan here. She succinctly pointed out to me that we're all humans are disabled by space. Space is a disabling environment. No matter how much exercise you try to do in space, there tends to be things like bone loss, like muscle loss, that if you have a long-term stint in space, you usually are very weak when you come back into Earth's gravity and have to spend time recovering. There are concerns about radiation, increasing cancer risks. They've discovered that astronauts tend to suffer from vision changes due to some effects in their eyes from cosmic rays that they're still trying to study. So yeah, this is an environment we weren't evolved to survive in and thrive in. And so no matter what, this is an alien environment that we are all slightly or extremely disabled by. And so the argument from this community is that we should push towards making space more physically accessible to disabled space travelers, both through easing our own restrictions on who can be an astronaut, and also by designing spacecraft and habitats and equipment to be more accessible to people with a variety of physical abilities. So there have been a couple of really good examples in recent years that I want to mention. One is that the European Space Agency started what they call their para-astronaut program. I don't entirely love that name, but in their latest astronaut class, they specifically sought out, recruited, and then hired an astronaut with a limb difference. I think that their original call for applicants called for people who maybe were shorter than the usual limitations or had a limb difference, like a difference in length or an amputated limb. And in this case, they hired they're selected John McFall, who's one of their astronaut candidates. This is him seen here. He's doing one of these parabolic airplane flights that simulates weightlessness for several seconds at the top of the flight, and you can see him there with his prosthetic limb. And so it's not necessarily true that John McFall is going to fly into space. That's true of all astronaut candidates, but the ESA is focused on trying to figure out what are the actual needs for someone with this kind of disability and how feasible, they call it their para-astronaut feasibility program, which is a great direction to start down. I wish they'd move a little bit faster, and I'm hoping NASA gets on board with this kind of concept as well. However, as much as this particular photo was touted in some of the press as being the first time a para-astronaut has done a weightless simulation, there's another group, I think based in the US, that has been doing this kind of research for several years now, and that is called Astro Access, which Sherry Wells Jensen has participated in as well. But they are a group advocating for more disabled space travelers. And in particular, they're very interested in researching what kind of technological needs these space travelers would actually have. And they're doing that with these same sort of weightless simulations. So this is a picture of, on the right, Dana Bowles, who is one of their mobility ambassadors. You can see that Dana Bowles has several limb differences. And that she's talking to astronaut Katie Coleman. And you can see that Dana is holding on to some connectors onto the wall of the aircraft here. And so what they do on these parabolic flights is they look into what kind of equipment would, say, a person with significant limb differences have in order to be able to move about the cabin. What kind of straps would they need to hold in for safety reasons? How would they navigate around? A lot of their other ambassadors do just really fascinating similar research. For example, there are blind and low vision participants who test whether they can read Braille off the side of the aircraft cabin while they're floating in weightlessness. They've had deaf participants see how easy or difficult it is to have a sign language conversation while they're floating in a weightless environment at different orientations to each other. Just all kinds of really fascinating research, as well as being ambassadors to the able-bodied world, saying, hey, this is something we need to all start envisioning together. And I find this fascinating for a couple of reasons. One is that, as Sherry Wells Jensen said in her Reclaiming Space chapter, loosening the restrictions on physical ability for astronaut candidates is only going to increase our pool of highly qualified candidates for space travel, which is going to improve our missions and our space travel plans in general. But also, this development of accessibility technology and spacecraft is only going to make space more comfortable, more usable, and safer for all space travelers, including able-bodied astronauts. So an example I like to give is that suppose that we develop much better technology interfaces, for example, and equipment for operating by space travelers who are blind or have low vision. Once we have that technology on board, then if there's some kind of an emergency where the power fails and all the lights go off, then even the sighted astronauts are going to be able to better navigate the spacecraft and operate the equipment because they have this extra accessibility technology. And so there's a lot of examples like this. This is pretty well known on Earth as well, that the more accessible you make a place, the more useful it is for everyone. We all benefit from ramps being provided in addition to stairs, for example. So just to wrap up, I have made the argument that including diverse cultures as we consider what we want to do in space, including on the moon, has both practical and ethical benefits. But I will point out, this is something that Jamie and I learned, and everyone is constantly learning. This requires more than just saying, oh, we welcome all voices, we have an open mind, everyone's welcome. It really takes deliberate effort. And in particular, it takes funding. And this is something that I think is still missing from a lot of otherwise well-intentioned organizations who want to be inclusive, but these communities that you want to welcome to your table, first of all, they have their own tables, they're doing their own work already, and we all have to pay rent and eat. So at a certain point, we really need to put more effort into deliberately funding this inclusion and this work that we're asking these communities to do for us. And so that's always a point that I like to make as well. The other thing is that inviting these diverse voices into the conversation means that you're going to have to be willing to listen to people who perhaps fundamentally disagree with your plans for humans in space. But I think this in itself is a useful thing to do. Jamie made a great case for it as well. And I would say as long as everyone is acting in good faith, it's extremely vital that you engage in these kinds of conversations anyway, including with people who think that we shouldn't be going to space at all. Because these kinds of critics are the ones who will have the best understanding and ideas of what are the potential bad consequences from the plans that you're stating. So engaging in these conversations means, well, for one thing, they might convince you that they're right, in which case you have avoided making a bad decision. But if nothing else, they're going to force you to strengthen your arguments and make you a better advocate for your plans for space. So all of this is a good exercise to have for a number of reasons. And the last thing I'll just say, if you'll indulge me for one moment of marketing, is that my nonprofit, the Just Space Alliance, has a workshop coming up in 2 days. If you're interested in what I've been talking about, and in particular in the environmental and sustainability part of it, we're doing a workshop on environmental justice in space. It's going to be virtual. It's free. Registration is open now. We're going to be having people from environmental justice movements here on Earth, including from diverse non-Western cultures, talking with people in the space world who are concerned about potential damage we're doing to the space environment. So I'll just leave that up there in case anyone wants to write that down, and you're all welcome to join us there as well.
Thank you, Erica. Your ideas are indeed worth of being taken into consideration.
Thank you.
But I have a question, a little bit off track probably, but let me say that I have read your book of Earth, Ethical Questions and Quandaries for Living in Outer Space. And after having thoroughly examined a great number of possible ethical issues regarding space settlements, from property to land distribution, from possible exploitation to environmental sustainability, from reproduction in space to health risks, etc., and having also suggested possible solutions, you conclude, if you can picture a better world in space, why not on Earth? If you are willing to fight for the health and happiness of the hypothetical residents of a future space settlement, what's stopping you from fighting for the rights of your neighbors today? Why wait for the rockets to be built? Let's take what we have learned from this exploration of how to help humanity thrive in space and use it to create a civilization that deserves to spread itself to the stars. I was really surprised by this conclusion, but I like it very much. However, can you explain it better to our audience?
Sure. I think so. This is near the conclusion of my book, I think, where I was getting a bit poetical, as is our tendency near the end of things. But I think what I was touching on here is something that we have also embedded in the mission statement of my nonprofit. I mentioned that the Just Space Alliance advocates for a more ethical future in space, but also tries to turn that around and harness people's excitement for space to think about ethical issues here today. And that's based on something I noticed in myself as I started learning about a lot of these topics, which is that there's something about thinking about building a community from scratch in space and thinking about the ethical issues and human rights questions and how you would address those. That provides a kind of psychological flexibility that lets you consider more radical, or at least radically different solutions in that society than you could ever imagine being possible in our day-to-day societies here on Earth. And that happened to me a number of times, and I've seen it in other people. Something about that science fiction feeling and context and the remoteness of it lets us consider solutions that, sure, we'd like to see here on Earth, but it's hard to imagine how to get there from here. And so that's one of the reasons that I argue that it's useful to do these kinds of thought experiments about space. Possibly none of these issues, these human rights issues, are going to happen in my lifetime or several generations from now. But I think it's still an exercise worth doing, because not only do we then think about human rights, which is always good to think about, but it lets us really, really consider these radical solutions and to seek out a diverse number of perspectives on what the possible solutions can be. Certainly forced me to learn much more about human history than I ever had, and the way that different communities, different than my own society, have addressed some of these problems. And so I think that is what I was arguing there, is that as we do these kinds of exercises, these thought experiments, as we think about our future in space, I think we always need to set aside some time to turn that around and say, okay, what I've learned about and what I've thought about, how could I actually apply that today? Because that's I don't know if this is an idiom in your language, but we like to say an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So the more we can implement these good ethical approaches and human rights protections in our societies today, the easier it will be to perpetuate them forward into space in the future. So yeah, I think that would be my summary of what I said in that part.
I would love to follow up on that if I could, because I think I literally spent the last 2 weeks kind of putting Erica's work into practice. I don't want to describe too much because it's going to sound braggadocious, and I hate seeming that way. But the reason I'm unaffiliated is because I resigned from my former employer. And I resigned because I could no longer square the contradiction of the misalignment of my values with theirs. And being unaffiliated has now given me the liberty to think about, who do I want to actually help with the position, well, the no longer position, but the perspective and the influence that I have. And what I decided was that Erica was right. We need to have people advocating for labor in space. And I live in Wichita, where we call ourselves the air capital of the world, where we build 737 MAXs, where companies are interested in starting to get into space structures. I decided I needed to walk into the IMAUW, the local machinists and aerospace workers union, to let them know somebody had their back. And I dropped off a copy of Reclaiming Space, a copy of some papers on labor ethics in space, and I told them I would love to teach all of their employees about workplace safety, workplace empowerment, and what it is that engineers are supposed to be doing that may not be doing according to the NSP Code of Ethics, because I've been teaching engineering ethics for the past 5 years, and let's just say I know that when planes go down, it's not the fault of the people actually installing the bolts. It's the fault of management who tells them how many bolts they can install.
I'll also note that this approach is very much parallels what a lot of people on the engineering side use when they're developing space technology. So NASA has always been very proud of their spin-off technologies. I know a lot of people who are working on technologies for space settlement, lunar exploration, lunar mining, are also very interested in the fact that learning how to better grow crops in a waterless environment, or how to extract resources more safely, or build medical equipment that can work in space is going to help people here on Earth. And so it's just the same approach, just on the human rights and ethics side as well.
Okay. I have a question for Jamie too. In the opening chapter of the book, Introduction to Reclaiming Space, written by the 3 co-editors, you are against the narrative of the manifest destiny. You write, manifest destiny, the mid-19th century idea that Americans had a God-given right and responsibility to expand across North America, was used to justify the displacement and genocide of the continent's indigenous people. It's true. However, it is generally believed that this narrative and the one of the final frontier gave a strong support to the success of the Apollo missions. Bonestell's paintings, Billy Lie's popular books, TV shows, cartoons, movies were an effective preparation to the 1962 JFK's speech at Rice University. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard, because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills, because that challenge is one that we are willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one which we intend to win. Probably without the joint endeavor of the whole country, moved by the concept of manifest destiny, USA would not win the space race, and history would be different. Maybe even worse
Certainly,
than
yeah.
now. Please.
So I will make sure to clarify, I don't remember who in particular wrote that sentence. I might have been me, might not have been me, but my name's on it, so I should stand by it regardless, right? So no one here can change the past, and I hope nobody gains the power to do so, because I wouldn't have lived my life any differently if I got to do it over again, and I'd hate to think someone could interfere with that. So, yes, we got to the moon, and this is something that Sherry Jensen says in a wonderful talk she gave a few years ago, which is among the first things you will find if you look for her on YouTube. We did it, right? We got to the moon and back. No one died in space, although people died on the ground, at least from the American program. And yes, it was this glorious accomplishment. And do I wish it could have happened in a more inclusive way? Yes. Do I wish it could have happened without requiring all of the exploitation that it did? Yes. Do I recognize that before the actual landings, NASA was actually an unpopular agency? Yes, and NASA chief historians have written about this. So there was harsh criticism of the space program up until it became a success. And let's not forget that, it really was the success that started to make us feel proud about the space program in America, and not anything that really led up to that. That was a real pivotal moment in culture. And it's difficult to imagine what the world would be like had that not happened when it happened, right? But the future is not already set in stone, right? The stars are going to keep evolving. New planets are going to keep forming until the heat death of the universe. What we have the power to do is learn from the past and make choices that are more aligned with our values, that are more aligned with actually succeeding at the things we want to succeed at. I worry that we are too presumptive, that we assume that we already know things that we can't even possibly imagine we need to know. And the problem I have is I don't know who not to ask for help. It sort of feels like each one of us knows something about how to keep the world going, and hence each one of us probably has something to say about how to keep a world going in space. So for me, it's much more difficult to find reasons to exclude people from consideration than it is to include. And although we might have made mistakes in the past, now that we know better, or at least now that we're learning better and listening better, we can be better into the future. So I don't think I can hope for more than that. So no, I can't offer you reasons to go back in time and change things.
Sure.
And I certainly wouldn't. And I don't want to discount the height of the accomplishment. I mean, no human has traveled further from the Earth since then, and that's something worth remarking on. And let's make sure, let's make sure when we go further, it's a lot of us that do so. Erica, sorry.
No, that's fine. I'd also like to follow up since you followed up mine, because I also might have written that sentence. I think any one of us could have. First of all, just because that is the way that human landing on the moon was accomplished doesn't mean that's the only way that it could have been accomplished. It's hard. Historians never want to talk about counterfactuals, but it's possible we could have taken some different approach, different rhetoric, and also gone to the moon. And the other thing I'll point out, and this is not a criticism of the people who worked so hard on the Apollo mission, which I'm very much in awe of, but the Apollo mission was successful. The Apollo program was successful in that it got humans to the moons, but it was not successful in the sense of creating a sustainable human presence on the moon. And maybe that wasn't the Apollo program's job in particular, but the rhetoric that got us to the moon did not keep us on the moon. And so that's another reason to say, is there another vision and motivation for space that would lead to a more sustainable presence?
Yeah, sure. Maybe we have time for a last question. Last year, NASA organized a workshop about Artemis, ethics, and society. You were both invited, and also Linda Billings was there. I've read the report and found out that you and other participants have highlighted many of the ethical problems associated with the upcoming lunar and Mars missions. And solutions have also been suggested and strong recommendations made. Do you feel that NASA can welcome your suggestions and change the ethical approach to space exploration? Erica, please, you can start.
Great. I was going to make Jamie go first. I very much appreciated being invited to participate in that, and I was very heartened to see that that NASA and the organizers wanted to incorporate more people from the space ethics side of things. I would say we didn't even so much point out ethical problems as argue that we need more consideration of what the ethical problems might be, and they had started on this first step. But one thing I think I learned the most from that workshop and that experience is something I was already aware of as a scientist who works in the space of ethics, that and the ethics of space, which is that we speak very different languages. These two fields of study we have, I'm talking about science and engineering and ethics and humanities and philosophy. We structure our arguments in different ways. We have different definitions of certain central terms like ethics and good and value and sustainability. And so there are a lot of stumbling blocks in that conversation where we notice things like that. And so what I hope to see as a result, and I don't know if I'm optimistic or not about whether this is going to happen, but I just hope to see more conversation and more welcoming of those perspectives by the technological side of things and the policy side of things to welcome and push through this language barrier between these fields. That's what I'm looking forward to.
I need to be careful because
Yes.
I don't want to reveal too much information. I knew about the planning of this event for quite some time, and the organizer, Dr. Zachary Purtle, has got a background in both philosophy and engineering. In fact, one of the world experts in philosophy of engineering. And I've been acquainted with Dr. Purtle since about 2018. So I've known about his, and by way of him, OTPS's interest in thinking about these issues for quite some time. And what I would say is I'm hopeful about the future, but it's going to be a very sort of slow and steady wins the race game, as opposed to a door-busting game, at least until we see progressive change at the national level. I think whenever you see a big shift in Congress to start representing younger generations, NASA is going to follow suit. There are people at NASA that are kind of waiting to start doing some of these things that they've heard about for years from folks like Erica and I and our colleagues. I think the message is being received. It's that the message is not being implemented because there are older voices that are concerned. And I think if I say more, I'll say too much.
Okay. Well, I see that there are no questions from the audience, so we can close the webinar here. And I wish to thank you very much for this really deep and interesting conversation. I hope there will be more opportunities to talk about space and space ethics. Thank you very much, and see you soon.
Thank you
Thank
for
you so
inviting me.
much.